The dust devil twisted across the barren plains like a ghost seeking vengeance, and in its wake rode a man who had already made peace with dying. His name was Jacob Thorne, and he carried more scars than hope, more silence than words. The year was 1882, and the Arizona Territory stretched endlessly in all directions, harsh and unforgiving as the woman who had summoned him here. 25 men had already tried. 25 men had already failed. Their bones bleached white under the merciless sun, scattered across the rocky outcroppings where the beast had claimed them one by one. But Jacob wasn't like the others. He wasn't here for glory or gold or the promise of easy money. He was here because sometimes a man reaches a point where dying feels like the only honest thing left to do. The town of Bitter Creek sat like a collection of broken teeth against the horizon, its weathered buildings leaning into each other for support they couldn't give. Dust coated everything, from the hitching posts to the faces of the few souls brave enough to still call this place home. The wind carried whispers of death and the acrid scent of fear that had settled over the settlement like a shroud. Jacob reined in his horse at the edge of town, studying the scene before him. Windows shuttered tight in the middle of the day, streets empty except for tumbleweeds and shadows. Even the saloon stood silent, its bat-wing doors hanging motionless in the still air. This was a town waiting to die, and everyone knew it. The challenge had spread across 3 territories like wildfire. A widow woman with eyes like winter storms and a voice that could cut through steel had issued a call that echoed from cantina to cattle ranch to mining camp. Her words were simple but deadly as a rattlesnake's bite. If you're a real cowboy, then kill that coyote. Prove your worth and claim your prize. But this wasn't just any coyote. This was something else entirely. Something that walked on 4 legs but thought with a cunning that belonged to no ordinary beast. It had started with the livestock, entire herds vanishing in the night without so much as a hoof print left behind. Then came the travelers, seasoned men who knew these lands better than their own mothers' faces, found torn apart in ways that defied explanation. The creature had grown bolder with each kill, each victory. It seemed to understand that fear was as powerful a weapon as fang or claw. Now it haunted the very edges of town, circling like death itself, waiting for the right moment to finish what it had started. Jacob dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a sound like thunder in the oppressive quiet. His horse, a steel-gray mare named Ash, stood patient and still, trained for situations where movement meant death. She had carried him through Apache raids and cattle wars, through blizzards that could freeze a man's soul and heat that could bake his bones. If there was loyalty left in this world, it lived in the steady beat of her heart. The first person Jacob saw was a boy, maybe 12, peering at him from behind a water barrel. The kid's eyes were too old for his face, aged by the kind of terror that steals childhood away piece by piece. When Jacob nodded in his direction, the boy vanished like smoke, leaving only the echo of bare feet slapping against wooden planks. The saloon doors creaked as Jacob pushed through them, spurs jangling in the hollow silence. Inside, the air hung thick with tobacco smoke and desperation. 3 men sat at separate tables, nursing whiskey that had gone warm hours ago. None of them looked up when he entered. The bartender, a man whose belly had seen better days and whose eyes had seen too much, wiped down a glass that was already clean. Jacob approached the bar, laid a silver dollar on the scarred wood, and waited. The bartender poured without being asked, the amber liquid catching what little light filtered through the grimy windows. The whiskey burned going down, but it was an honest burn, the kind that reminded a man he was still breathing. From the corner of the saloon came a voice like gravel mixed with honey, rough but unmistakably feminine. "You're here about the bounty." Jacob turned slowly. In the shadows sat a woman who commanded attention without demanding it. Her black dress spoke of mourning, but her posture spoke of strength. Silver hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that had been beautiful once and remained striking now. But it was her eyes that held him, cold as mountain streams. sharp as broken glass. They seemed to look right through a man's flesh and bone to whatever truth he carried inside. This was Victoria Ashford, the widow who had issued the challenge. The woman whose husband had been the creature's first human victim. The woman who had watched this town slowly bleed to death while 25 men rode out to face the beast and never came back. She rose from her table with the fluid grace of someone who had never learned to doubt herself. Each step was measured, deliberate, like a chess player moving pieces on a board only she could see. When she reached the bar, she stood close enough that Jacob could smell the lavender water she wore. A touch of civilization in a place that had forgotten what civilized meant. 25 men, she said, her voice carrying the weight of each death. 25 good men who thought they could succeed where others failed. Cowboys, hunters, soldiers, even a few Apache trackers who knew these lands better than anyone, all dead now, feeding the desert with their blood. Jacob met her gaze without flinching. Maybe they weren't the right men. A smile ghosted across her lips, there and gone like lightning. "And you think you are?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he finished his whiskey, feeling the burn settle in his chest like a small fire. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending something metallic clanging against a post. The sound was lonely, mournful, like a bell tolling for the dead. "I think," Jacob said finally, "that sometimes the right man isn't the one who plans to secede. Sometimes it's the one who's got nothing left to lose." Victoria studied him with those winter eyes, taking in the weathered face, the careful way he held himself, the gun that hung low on his hip with the easy familiarity of long partnership. She saw the scars that crossed his knuckles, the way his shoulders carried weight that wasn't physical, the quiet stillness that marked men who had walked too close to death too many times. "What's your name, cowboy?" "Jacob Thorne." She nodded as if the name explained something. "I've heard that name before. You're the one who tracked down the Mendoza gang after they hit the silver train. The one who brought in Black Pete Morrison when the territorial marshal couldn't find him." Jacob said nothing. The past was the past, and talking about it wouldn't change what was coming. Victoria walked to the window, gazing out at the empty street where heat waves danced like spirits above the dust. "This creature, Mr. Thorne, it's not like anything you've faced before. It's cunning, patient. It knows when men are coming for it, and it knows how to make them disappear without a trace. Some say it's not even natural, that it's something older than this territory, older than the people who named it. I've heard the stories." "Stories." She turned back to face him, and there was something fierce burning behind those cold eyes now. "My husband thought they were just stories too. Charles was a good man, a strong man. He'd fought Comanches and rustlers, survived the war and came home when so many didn't. But this thing took him apart like he was made of paper and twine." The bartender had gone very still, his cloth frozen on the glass. Even the other patrons seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for words that might explain the unexplainable. "It happened at dusk," Victoria continued, her voice growing distant. "Charles was checking the fence line on our northern pasture. I heard him scream once, just once, and then nothing. Nothing but the wind and the sound of cattle lowing in distress. When I found him the next morning, there wasn't enough left to—" She stopped, gathering herself. "There wasn't enough left to bury properly." Jacob absorbed this information without comment. He had seen what violence could do to a human body, had witnessed the aftermath of Apache raids and grizzly attacks. But something in Victoria's voice suggested this had been different. More personal, more deliberate. "The bounty," he said. "What exactly are you offering?" For the first time since he'd entered the saloon, Victoria smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. $5,000 in gold, more money than most men see in a lifetime, plus my ranch, 800 acres of good grazing land with water rights, and—" She paused, letting the silence stretch like a bowstring. "And my hand in marriage, if you're so inclined." The offer hung in the air like gun smoke. 5,000 in gold was more than generous. It was the kind of money that could set a man up for life, buy him a spread of his own, maybe even a chance at respectability. The ranch sweetened the deal considerably, but it was the final part that made the other men in the saloon shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Victoria Ashford was still a handsome woman, probably not yet 40. A widow with property and prospects. In a territory where women were scarce and good wives scarcer still, she would be considered quite a catch. But there was something in her eyes, something cold and calculating that suggested this wasn't about love or companionship. This was about something else entirely. And if I fail like the others, then you'll feed the desert like they did, and I'll find another man to take your place. Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather or the price of cattle. But I don't think you'll fail, Mr. Thorne. There's something different about you. Something the others didn't have. Jacob studied her face, searching for clues about what she really wanted. The bounty was generous to the point of being suspicious. No creature, no matter how cunning or dangerous, was worth that kind of money unless there was more to the story than she was telling. "This beast," he said carefully. "How long has it been hunting in these parts?" 3 months, started right after the spring thaw. First it was just livestock, but then it got bolder, hungrier. She moved closer to him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her gray eyes. "The territorial governor has been pressuring me to abandon the town, to relocate the survivors somewhere safer. But I won't be driven from my home by some animal, no matter how clever it thinks it is." There was steel in her voice now, the kind of determination that had built this country one stubborn mile at a time. But there was something else too, something that made Jacob's instincts prickle like a horse sensing a storm. 25 men, all dead. All experienced hunters and fighters who should have been more than capable of dealing with even the most dangerous predator. The odds of that happening by chance were astronomical. Either this creature was unlike anything that had ever walked the earth, or there was more to this situation than met the eye. Jacob finished his whiskey and set the glass down with a soft click. "I'll need to see where it happened. Where your husband died, and where the others were found." Victoria nodded as if she had expected this. "Of course, but not today. The sun's getting low, and that's when it hunts. We'll ride out at first light." As if summoned by her words, a sound drifted through the evening air that made every man in the saloon go rigid. It started low, almost like the wind, but there was something in it that spoke to the primitive part of the brain that remembered when humans were prey. The howl rose and fell, weaving through the twilight like a thread of pure menace. It wasn't the call of any ordinary coyote. This was deeper, more resonant, carrying notes that seemed to vibrate in a man's chest and settle in his bones like a fever. The sound spoke of intelligence, of awareness, of something that knew exactly what effect it was having on the frightened people huddled in their homes. Victoria's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. "It knows we're talking about it," she said quietly. "It always knows." The howl faded into silence, leaving behind an emptiness that felt heavier than sound. Outside, a shutter banged once against a window, then went still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Jacob felt the familiar weight of his Colt against his hip, the worn grip smooth under his palm. He had drawn this gun in anger more times than he cared to count, had felt its recoil against his hand as it sent men to whatever judgment waited beyond the veil. But something told him that when he finally faced this creature, lead and powder might not be enough. "Tell me about the men who tried before me," he said. "What did they have in common?" Victoria moved back to her table, settling into her chair with the careful precision of someone who had learned to control every gesture. They were all confident, all certain they could succeed where others had failed. The first few went out alone, thinking stealth and skill would be enough. When their bodies were found, torn apart and scattered, the next group tried overwhelming force. 5 men, all armed with rifles, all experienced hunters. She paused to sip from a glass that appeared to contain nothing stronger than water. They lasted longer than the others. We heard gunshots in the night, dozens of them. By morning, the silence told us everything we needed to know. Jacob absorbed this information, filing it away with all the other pieces of the puzzle. And the Apache trackers? 2 brothers, Running Wolf and Stone Bear. They could follow a ghost across solid rock, knew every game trail and waterhole for 100 miles. They studied the creature's patterns for weeks before making their move. Victoria's voice grew softer, more distant. They were found 3 days later, high up in the rocks where no ordinary animal could have taken them. Whatever killed them had the strength to carry full-grown men up a cliff face. The bartender had given up any pretense of working and stood listening with the rest of them. In a place like Bitter Creek, information was currency, and what Victoria was sharing could mean the difference between life and death. There was one man, she continued, who came closer than the others. A cavalry captain named Morrison, retired from the Indian Wars. He had experience with unconventional tactics, knew how to think like his enemy. He lasted almost a week out there. What happened to him? Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. He came back. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Jacob felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise, that primitive warning system that had kept him alive through countless dangerous encounters. Came back how? Walking, middle of the night, 3 days after we'd given him up for dead. But he wasn't the same man who rode out. Something had broken inside him, something that couldn't be fixed with whiskey or time or prayer. Victoria's eyes grew distant, remembering. He kept talking about eyes, green eyes that watched him from the darkness, followed him wherever he went. Said the creature was playing with him, letting him live just to see how long it would take for the fear to drive him mad. Where is he now? Boot Hill, next to the others. Took his own life 2 days later. Left a note saying he couldn't stand being watched anymore. Couldn't stand waiting for it to come finish what it started. Jacob processed this new information, adding it to the growing picture of what he was facing. A creature intelligent enough to engage in psychological warfare, strong enough to carry grown men up cliff faces, cunning enough to avoid or overcome armed groups. And something about green eyes that had driven a hardened cavalry officer to suicide. The sun had set while they talked, and the saloon had grown darker despite the oil lamps flickering on the walls. Outside, Bitter Creek settled into the uneasy quiet that came with nightfall in a place where death stalked the shadows. Somewhere in the distance, a dog began to bark, then stopped abruptly as if something had silenced it. "You'll want a room for the night," Victoria said, rising from her chair. "Mrs. Henderson runs the boarding house next to the general store. Tell her I sent you and she'll see you're taken care of." Jacob stood as well, his joints protesting after the long ride. "What about you? Where will you be?" "Home. My ranch is 2 miles north of town, up the canyon road. I'll be safe enough behind locked doors and shuttered windows." She moved toward the saloon's entrance, then paused. "Mr. Thorne, don't try to be a hero tomorrow. Heroes are buried 6 feet deep just like cowards. Be smart instead." She pushed through the bat-wing doors and vanished into the night, leaving behind only the scent of lavender and the memory of those winter-gray eyes. Jacob stood for a moment, listening to the sound of her horse's hooves on the hard-packed street, then turned back to the bar. The bartender poured him another whiskey without being asked. "You really think you can kill that thing?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jacob lifted the glass, studying the amber liquid in the lamplight. "I think," he said carefully, "that there's more to this story than anyone's telling. And until I know what that is, I'm not making any promises." The other patrons had begun to drift away, heading for their homes or whatever shelter they could find before full darkness fell. Soon Jacob was alone with the bartender, a man whose name he didn't know but whose eyes held the weight of too many secrets. "You want some advice?" the bartender said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Don't trust her completely. Mrs. Ashford, I mean. She's not telling you everything." "What makes you say that?" The man glanced toward the doors, making sure they were truly alone. Because I knew her husband, Charles. Good man, like she said, but he wasn't checking fence lines the night he died. He was meeting someone. Someone who'd been sending him messages for weeks before it happened. Jacob set down his glass. What kind of messages? The kind a man doesn't share with his wife. The kind that get a man killed. The bartender straightened up, suddenly looking nervous. That's all I'm saying. You didn't hear it from me. Before Jacob could ask more questions, the man had retreated to the far end of the bar, busying himself with tasks that didn't need doing. The conversation was over, but it had provided another piece of the puzzle, another shadow in a picture that was already darker than midnight. Jacob finished his whiskey and headed for the boarding house, his spurs echoing in the empty street. Behind shuttered windows, he could feel eyes watching his progress, marking his passage through their dying town. Tomorrow he would begin hunting the creature that had killed 25 men. Tonight, he would try to understand why he felt like he was walking into a trap that had been set long before he arrived. The boarding house was a narrow 2-story building wedged between the general store and what had once been a barber shop. Mrs. Henderson proved to be a thin, nervous woman who jumped at shadows and spoke in whispers. She led him up a creaking staircase to a small room that smelled of dust and disuse. "You're the one going after it," she said as she handed him a key. It wasn't a question. "I am." She shook her head sadly. "You seem like a decent man. Shame to see you throw your life away for nothing." "Maybe it won't be for nothing." Mrs. Henderson paused in the doorway, her hand on the frame. "That creature, it's not natural. There's something wrong with it, something evil. The way it kills, the way it thinks, it's like it enjoys the fear as much as the blood. Have you seen it yourself?" "Oh, once. From my window upstairs." It was standing in the street just after midnight, bold as brass, looking up at the houses like it was choosing which one to visit next. Stood on 2 legs sometimes, 4 legs others. And those eyes? She shuddered. Green as bottle glass and twice as sharp. It looked right at me, and I swear it smiled. Not like an animal smiles, but like a man who knows a secret you don't want him to know. She hurried away then, leaving Jacob alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that he was dealing with something far beyond a simple predator. He checked his weapons methodically, the ritual as familiar as breathing. His Colt was clean and loaded, the action smooth as silk. His rifle, a Winchester that had never failed him, rested against the wall within easy reach. His knife, sharp enough to shave with, hung at his belt. But as he prepared for sleep, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that all the weapons in the world might not be enough for what waited in the darkness beyond Bitter Creek. Something had killed 25 experienced men. Something that played games with its prey and drove cavalry officers to suicide. Something that stood on 2 legs sometimes and 4 legs others, and smiled with intelligence that belonged to no earthly creature. Outside his window, the night pressed close against the glass, and somewhere in that darkness, green eyes were watching and waiting for morning to come. Dawn came to Bitter Creek like a reluctant witness, pale and hesitant, as if even the sun knew better than to shine too brightly on a place marked for death. Jacob woke before first light, his body trained by years of dangerous living to rise when darkness still held the world in its grip. The boarding house creaked around him, old wood settling into another day of watching men ride out to die. He dressed methodically, checking each piece of gear with the careful attention of someone who understood that forgotten details killed faster than bullets. His boots were worn but sturdy, broken in by thousands of miles of hard country. His hat, sweat-stained and weathered, sat at the angle that kept the sun from his eyes and the rain from his collar. Everything had its place. Everything served its purpose. The street outside lay empty except for the shadows that seemed to pool in doorways and alleys like spilled blood. Even the dogs were silent, hiding in whatever shelter they could find, waiting for the sun to climb high enough to chase away the things that hunted in the gray hours between night and day. Victoria Ashford was waiting for him at the edge of town, mounted on a black mare that stood 16 hands high and carried herself like royalty. The widow had traded her mourning dress for riding clothes, practical leather and canvas that spoke of someone who knew how to work the land. But the cold intelligence in her eyes remained unchanged, sharp as winter wind across open water. "Sleep well?" she asked as he approached, leading Ash by the reins. "Well enough." Jacob swung into the saddle, feeling the familiar comfort of leather and steel beneath him. "Though I had some interesting conversations before I turned in." Victoria's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes like lightning in distant clouds. "This is a small town, Mr. Thorne. People talk. Most of what they say is gossip and superstition. Maybe, but sometimes gossip points toward truth." He adjusted his hat against the rising sun. "Your husband wasn't checking fence lines the night he died." For a moment, the only sound was the creak of leather and the soft whisper of wind through sagebrush. Victoria's hands remained steady on her reins, but Jacob caught the slight tightening around her eyes that marked someone who had just heard something they hadn't expected. "Who told you that? Does it matter? What matters is whether it's true." Victoria turned her horse toward the northern trail, the one that led up into the rocky country where death waited with green eyes and unnatural cunning. "Charles was a complicated man, Mr. Thorne. He had business dealings that I didn't always understand or approve of. But whatever he was doing that night, it doesn't change what killed him." They rode in silence for a while, following a path that wound through stands of juniper and pinon pine. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of heat to come. Under different circumstances, it might have been a pleasant ride through beautiful country, but Jacob could feel the weight of watching eyes, the sense of being studied by something that remained just beyond the edge of sight. The first kill site was marked by a circle of stones that someone had arranged around scattered bones. What remained of the man who had died here was little more than fragments, bleached white by sun and wind and picked clean by scavengers. But it was the arrangement that caught Jacob's attention. The bones hadn't been scattered randomly by wild animals. They had been placed with deliberate care, forming a pattern that spoke of intelligence and purpose. Victoria dismounted and stood at the edge of the stone circle, her face impassive as carved marble. This was the first one, a drifter named Pete Hawkins. He was camping here when it found him. Jacob studied the scene, reading the story written in disturbed earth and broken stone. "How long between when he was killed and when you found him?" 2 days. We heard the screaming the first night, but by the time anyone worked up the courage to investigate, there was only this." She gestured at the bone circle. "And that," she pointed to a boulder about 30 feet away. Carved into its face, as if burned there by acid or intense heat, was a symbol Jacob had never seen before. It looked like a twisted tree, its branches reaching in directions that hurt to follow, its roots digging deep into stone that should have been too hard for any earthly tool to mark. "Every kill site has one," Victoria said quietly. "Different symbols, but always carved into stone, always burned deep. The Apache who saw them wouldn't even speak of what they meant. They just rode away and never came back." Jacob approached the boulder, running his fingers over the carved symbol. The stone was smooth, as if it had been heated to the point of melting and then cooled again. No tool he knew could have made such a mark, and the precision of the carving suggested skill far beyond what any animal could possess. "The second site is a mile north," Victoria said, remounting her horse. "Then we'll see where Charles died." They found similar scenes at each location, bone circles, carved symbols, and signs of violence that defied natural explanation. At the third site, where 5 men had made their last stand, Jacob found something that made his blood run cold. Bullet holes in the surrounding rocks, dozens of them, but not scattered randomly as they would be in a normal gunfight. They were arranged in precise patterns, forming shapes that complemented the carved symbols like some kind of grotesque artwork. "They hid it," Victoria said, reading his expression. "We found blood, dark as tar and thick as molasses, but instead of weakening it, the wound seemed to make it stronger, angrier. By the time they reached the final site, where Charles Ashford had died, the sun was high enough to drive the shadows from all but the deepest crevices. This place was different from the others. The bone circle here was larger, more elaborate, and the symbol carved into the cliff face above seemed to pulse with malevolent life, even in broad daylight. But it was the message scratched into a nearby tree that made Jacob's hand move instinctively toward his gun. Someone had carved words into the bark with what looked like claws, letters that dripped with old sap like dried blood. The message was simple but chilling. She knows what she did. Victoria had gone very still, her face pale as winter snow. That wasn't there before, she whispered. I've been to this place a dozen times, and that message was never there. Jacob studied the carving more closely. The bark around the letters was fresh, the sap still sticky. Whatever had made this mark had done so recently, perhaps within the last day or two, since word of his arrival had spread through Bitter Creek. What does it mean? He asked, though he suspected he already knew. Victoria didn't answer immediately. She dismounted and walked to the edge of the bone circle, staring down at the remains of her husband with an expression Jacob couldn't quite read. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Charles wasn't just checking fence lines that night, and he wasn't meeting another woman, if that's what you're thinking. She looked up at Jacob, and for the first time since he'd met her, there was genuine fear in those winter-gray eyes. He was meeting it, the creature. He'd been communicating with it. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Jacob felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting, forming a picture that was darker and more complex than anything he had imagined. How do you communicate with something like that? Dreams, at first. Charles started having dreams about a month before he died. Vivid dreams where something spoke to him in a language he didn't understand but somehow knew the meaning of. It told him things, showed him things. Secrets about the land, about the people in town, about me. Victoria began to pace along the edge of the circle, her movements agitated, desperate. Then the dream started bleeding into his waking hours. He would hear voices when no one was there, see symbols carved into walls that only he could see. He became obsessed with coming out here, with finding the source of the voices. And you let him? Her laugh was bitter as alkali water. Let him? Mr. Thorne, you didn't know my husband. Charles was a stubborn man who made his own decisions. When he set his mind to something, wild horses couldn't drag him away from it. I begged him to leave well enough alone, to pack up and move somewhere safer. But he said he had to know the truth. What truth? Victoria stopped pacing and turned to face him fully. The truth about what happened here before the town was built. The truth about why this particular piece of ground is cursed. The truth about what my family did to deserve what's happening to us. Jacob felt the familiar tingle that came when all the pieces of a puzzle were about to fall into place. Your family? My maiden name was Blackwood. My grandfather, Elias Blackwood, was one of the first settlers in this area. He claimed this land, built the first ranch, started what eventually became Bitter Creek. Victoria's voice grew distant, haunted. But he didn't claim empty land. There were people here before him, people who had been here for generations. The picture was becoming clearer now, painted in shades of guilt and retribution that stretched back decades. Jacob had seen this story before in different forms across the frontier. Settlers taking land from natives, violence begetting violence, blood calling for blood across the generations. What did he do? Victoria walked to the base of the cliff where her husband's symbol was carved, running her fingers over the stone with something approaching reverence. There was a tribe here, a small band of Apache who considered this place sacred. They had ceremonies here, rituals that connected them to spirits they believed lived in the rocks and the wind. Grandfather didn't care about their beliefs. He wanted the land, and he took it. That's not unusual for those days. Happened all over the territory. But this was different. Victoria's voice was barely audible now, as if speaking the words aloud might summon something better left sleeping. Grandfather didn't just drive them off their land. He poisoned their water source, knowing they would have to return for the spring ceremonies. When they came back, he was waiting with hired guns. They killed every member of the tribe except one. Jacob waited, knowing there was more, sensing they were approaching the heart of the darkness that had claimed 25 lives and was reaching for his own. A young shaman named Walking Shadow. He escaped into the rocks, wounded but alive. Before he died, he performed a ritual, a calling that bound something to this place, something that would wait and watch until the time came for justice. And you think that something is what's been killing people? Victoria nodded slowly. I think Walking Shadow called something from beyond the veil, something that has been sleeping in the earth for 60 years, waiting for the right moment to wake up and collect what's owed, my grandfather's sins, visited on his children and his children's children. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture that was both clearer and more terrifying than anything Jacob had imagined. This wasn't just a hunt for a dangerous animal. This was a reckoning that had been building for decades, a debt that had come due with interest compounded by years of blood and suffering. Why now? He asked. If this thing has been waiting for 60 years, why start killing now? Victoria's smile was sad and knowing. Because now there's only one Blackwood left. Me. The last of the line. The final payment on a debt that can only be settled in blood. The wind picked up suddenly, whipping through the canyon with a sound like voices crying in the distance. Somewhere in the rocks above them, something moved. A shadow that was there and gone too quickly to be sure it had ever existed at all. But Jacob felt the weight of attention, the sense of being watched by something that had learned patience in the long years of waiting. So the bounty, he said slowly. The reward you're offering. It's not about protecting the town or getting rid of a dangerous animal. It's about finding someone willing to stand between you and something that wants you dead. Partly, Victoria admitted. But it's more than that. This thing, whatever it is, won't be satisfied with just my death. It wants to destroy everything my family built, everything that carries the Blackwood name, the ranch, the town, every person who benefited from my grandfather's crimes. It won't stop until there's nothing left but bones and dust. Jacob studied her face, searching for signs of deception or madness. But what he saw was a woman who had lived with terrible knowledge for too long, who had watched her world slowly crumble under the weight of inherited guilt. The fear in her eyes was real, but so was the determination. She was the last guardian of a cursed legacy, and she was willing to pay any price to see it ended properly. The other men who tried, he said. Did they know all this? Some of it. Enough to understand what they were facing wasn't natural, but I didn't tell them everything. I was afraid if they knew the full truth, they wouldn't take the job. And now you're telling me because... Victoria's laugh held no humor. Because 25 men have died, and I'm running out of options. Because that message on the tree means it's getting tired of waiting, ready to finish what it started. And because something about you tells me you might actually have a chance where the others failed. Jacob considered this, weighing everything he had learned against his own instincts and experience. The rational part of his mind said this was madness, that curses and vengeful spirits belonged in campfire stories, not in the real world where men lived and died by skill and luck and the speed of their draw. But another part of him, the part that had kept him alive through countless dangerous encounters, whispered that there were more things in heaven and earth than could be explained by reason alone. If I agree to this, he said finally, if I go after this thing knowing what I know now, what happens when it's dead? If it can be killed, Victoria corrected. If it can be killed, then the curse dies with it. The debt is paid, the books are balanced, and whatever's left of Bitter Creek can try to rebuild. And if it can't be killed? Her eyes met his, and in them he saw the reflection of his own mortality. Then you'll join the others in feeding the desert, and I'll keep looking for someone who can succeed where you failed. The honesty was brutal but refreshing. No false promises, no guarantees of success. Just the cold arithmetic of survival in a place where death came in forms that defied understanding. Jacob had always preferred honest odds to comforting lies. Above them, a hawk circled in the clear blue sky, riding the thermals that rose from sun-heated stone. It was a beautiful day in magnificent country, the kind of day that made a man grateful to be alive. But beauty and death often walked hand in hand on the frontier, and Jacob had learned long ago not to trust appearances. He made his decision with the same calm deliberation he brought to everything else, not because he believed he could succeed where 25 others had failed, but because something in Victoria's story had awakened an old hunger in him. The hunger for purpose, for a cause worthy of the risks he was taking. "I'll need to prepare," he said. "If this thing is what you say it is, regular weapons might not be enough." Victoria nodded, relief and gratitude warring in her expression. "There's a man in town, Miguel Santos. He's half Apache, knows the old ways. If anyone can help you prepare for something like this, it's him." They rode back toward Bitter Creek in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what was to come. The sun climbed higher, driving away the morning chill and replacing it with the kind of heat that made mirages dance on distant horizons. Behind them, the kill sites lay empty under the merciless sky, bone circles and carved symbols marking places where men had learned too late that some hunts were different from others. As they reached the outskirts of town, Jacob caught sight of movement in the rocks above the trail. Just a flicker, gone almost before it registered, but enough to make him turn in his saddle for a better look. The rocks were empty now, showing nothing but stone and shadow and the scattered growth of hardy plants that could survive in such barren places. But the feeling of being watched remained, a pressure between his shoulder blades that spoke of eyes studying his every move. Something was up there, something that had followed them from the canyon, something that wanted him to know he was being measured for the grave. Jacob smiled grimly and touched the brim of his hat in a mock salute to whatever was watching. If the creature thought it could intimidate him with games of hide-and-seek, it was about to learn that some men didn't scare easily. Some men had walked so close to death for so long that the prospect of dying held no particular terror. But as they rode into the dusty streets of Bitter Creek, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the real test hadn't even begun yet. The creature had been toying with him so far, getting his measure, learning his scent. When it was ready to make its move, when it decided the time for games was over, then he would discover whether skill and courage and stubbornness were enough to face something that should not exist. In the meantime, he had preparations to make and a half-Apache guide to find. If he was going to hunt a legend, he needed to understand the rules by which legends lived and died. The sun was climbing toward its merciless peak when Jacob found Miguel Santos behind the old church, tending a small garden that somehow managed to flourish in soil that looked more suited to growing tombstones than vegetables. The man was older than Jacob had expected, maybe 60, with silver threading through black hair that hung loose past his shoulders. His hands moved among the plants with the careful precision of someone who understood that life was fragile and deserved respect. Santos looked up as Jacob approached, dark eyes taking in everything from the worn boots to the careful way the stranger carried himself. No words were exchanged at first. In the desert, men learned to measure each other in silence before wasting breath on conversation that might prove unnecessary. "You're the one going after the Shadow Walker," Santos said finally. It wasn't a question. "That what you call it?" Santos straightened slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. "My grandmother had words for things like that. Things that walk between worlds, things that remember old wounds and nurse them like a mother nurses a child." He studied Jacob's face with the intensity of someone reading tracks in difficult ground. "Mrs. Ashford sent you to me. She said you might know ways to fight something that isn't entirely natural." A smile ghosted across Santos's weathered features. "Fight? Boy, you don't fight something like this. You survive it if you're lucky. You honor it if you're smart. But fight?" He shook his head. "That's white man thinking, always wanting to put bullets in problems that were never meant to be solved with lead." Jacob felt a familiar frustration rising in his chest. "Then what do you suggest? 25 men are dead. And that thing isn't finished killing. 25 men who thought they could face a legend with the same tools they'd use on a rabid wolf. Santos walked to a wooden bench beneath the church's single window and settled himself like a man preparing for a long conversation. Sit. If you're truly going after the Shadow Walker, you need to understand what you're hunting. Jacob remained standing, but he listened. In his experience, old men who survived in dangerous country usually had good reasons for still breathing. Walking Shadow was my grandmother's cousin, Santos continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of someone telling a story that had been told many times before. Not his real name, you understand. His real name died with him in these rocks 60 years ago. But the stories about what he became, those live on. The wind picked up, carrying dust devils across the empty street. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the afternoon stillness. He was young when Elias Blackwood came with his hired guns and his poisoned water. Maybe 17, 18 years old. But he had the sight, could see things others couldn't, speak to spirits that lived in the old places. When his people were murdered, when their blood soaked into this sacred ground, he used that gift to call something from the shadow world. Something? Santos's eyes grew distant, as if he were seeing events that happened before he was born. The old stories call it Itzel Nalnish, the shadow that hunts, a spirit of vengeance that can take any form, that feeds on fear and grows stronger with each death. Walking Shadow bound it to this place, tied it to the Blackwood bloodline, gave it purpose and patience. Jacob finally sat, recognizing that this conversation was going to require more than a few minutes. So how do you kill something like that? You don't kill spirits, boy. They're already dead. But you can send them back to where they came from, if you know the right words, the right rituals. Santos reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch, worn smooth by decades of handling. The question is whether you're willing to pay the price for that knowledge. What price? Truth. The Shadow Walker feeds on lies, on secrets, on guilt that festers in darkness. To face it, you have to face yourself first. All the things you've done, all the people you failed to save, all the darkness you carry in your own heart. It'll use all of that against you. Jacob thought about the weight he carried, the faces that haunted his dreams, the choices that had seemed right at the time but left stains that wouldn't wash clean. Every man who lived by violence accumulated such burdens. The question was whether those burdens would crush him when the time came to stand firm. And if I can face all that? Santos smiled, and for the first time there was something like hope in his expression. Then you might have a chance, but you'll need more than courage, more than whatever weapons you're carrying. You'll need these. He opened the leather pouch and withdrew 3 items. The first was a small bundle of herbs tied with sinew, dried and brittle but still carrying a faint, sharp scent that made Jacob's nostrils burn. The second was a piece of obsidian, black as midnight and sharp enough to draw blood with the lightest touch. The third was a small bone, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. Sage and sweetgrass, blessed by my grandmother before she died. The obsidian comes from the sacred mountain, where the spirits first entered this world. And the bone. Santos paused, his voice growing softer. The bone comes from Walking Shadow himself, the last piece of his mortal form, saved by those who loved him. Jacob stared at the objects, feeling the weight of tradition and belief that surrounded them. What am I supposed to do with these? When you face the Shadow Walker, when it comes for you in whatever form it chooses, you burn the herbs. The smoke will protect you from its influence, keep it from getting inside your head. The obsidian you used to cut yourself here. He touched a spot over his heart. Your blood, freely given, shows respect for the old ways, acknowledges the debt that needs to be paid. And the bone, Santos's expression grew grave. That you return to Walking Shadow. You find his remains, somewhere in the rocks where he made his final stand, and you give him back what was taken. You speak the words I'm going to teach you. words in the old language that will release him from his binding and let him rest. It sounded simple enough, but Jacob had lived long enough to know that simple and easy were two entirely different things. What if the Shadow Walker doesn't want to be released? What if it prefers hunting to resting? Then you'll die like the others, but at least you'll die trying to do the right thing instead of just trying to collect a bounty. Santos began returning the items to their pouch. The choice is yours, boy. You can face this thing with bullets and hope, or you can face it with understanding and purpose. One way leads to death, the other might lead to something better. Jacob considered the options, weighing Santos's words against his own experience and instincts. Everything the old man had said made a kind of sense, even if it required accepting things that his rational mind wanted to reject. But rational thinking hadn't kept 25 men alive. Maybe it was time to try a different approach. "Teach me the words," he said. Santos smiled and began to speak in a language that was old when the first Europeans set foot on American soil. The words were complex, full of sounds that Jacob's throat wasn't designed to make, but he listened and repeated until he could manage a rough approximation of the pronunciation. The meaning was simpler: a request for forgiveness, an acknowledgement of wrong done, and a promise that justice would be served. By the time the lesson was finished, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Soon it would be dusk, the time when shadows grew long and dangerous things stirred in the darkness between day and night. Jacob tucked the leather pouch inside his shirt, feeling the weight of it against his chest like a talisman against the approaching darkness. "One more thing," Santos said as Jacob prepared to leave. "The Shadow Walker will come to you tonight. Not to kill, not yet, but to measure you, to see what kind of man you are. Don't try to fight it. Don't try to run. Just listen to what it has to say. Understanding your enemy is the first step toward defeating it." Jacob nodded and walked back toward the boarding house, his mind churning with everything he had learned. Behind him, Santos returned to his garden, but Jacob could feel the old man's eyes on his back until he turned the corner and disappeared from sight. That evening, as purple shadows crept across Bitter Creek like fingers of approaching night, Jacob sat on the porch of the boarding house and waited. His weapons were clean and ready, but they remained holstered. In his shirt pocket, the leather pouch rested against his heart, a reminder that some battles were fought with tools other than steel and lead. The town had gone quiet with the setting sun. Windows shuttered against whatever might walk the streets when honest folk were sleeping. Even the saloon had closed early, its patrons seeking the safety of locked doors and blessed darkness. Only Jacob remained outside, a solitary figure watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast desert sky. He didn't have to wait long. The Shadow Walker came with the first full darkness, not as a creature of fang and claw, but as something far more unsettling. It appeared at the edge of the street as a man-shaped darkness, taller than any human had a right to be, moving with fluid grace that suggested bones and muscles arranged in ways that defied natural law. Green eyes blazed in the darkness where a face should have been, and when it spoke, the voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the buildings and resonating in Jacob's chest like the beat of a funeral drum. "So," it said, "another one comes to die." Jacob remained seated, forcing his hands to stay relaxed on the arms of his chair. Maybe, but maybe not. 25 have tried. 25 have fed the earth with their blood. What makes you different from them? Nothing, Jacob admitted. And everything. Depends on how you look at it. The Shadow Walker moved closer, its form shifting and changing like smoke in a variable wind. Sometimes it looked almost human. Sometimes like a wolf walking on its hind legs. Sometimes like something that had no name in any earthly language. "You know why I hunt," it said. "You know the debt that must be paid. I know part of it. An old wrong, a call for justice that's been too long in coming. But I also know that innocent people are dying, people who had nothing to do with what happened 60 years ago." The green eyes flared brighter, and the temperature around Jacob dropped as if winter had suddenly arrived in the middle of summer. "Innocent? There are no innocent here. Every person in this place benefits from stolen land, from blood spilled in darkness, from lies told to cover the truth. They are all complicit in the crime. Jacob felt the weight of the Shadow Walker's presence pressing down on him like a physical force, testing his resolve, searching for weakness. But he had faced down Apache war chiefs and Mexican bandits, had stared death in the face more times than he could count. Fear was an old companion, familiar as his own shadow. Maybe, he said, but killing them won't bring back your people. It won't undo what was done. It'll just add more blood to ground that's already soaked with it. Justice demands blood. Justice demands truth. And the truth is that you've become what you once fought against. A killer who strikes from the darkness, who takes lives without mercy or discrimination. How is that different from what Elias Blackwood did? The Shadow Walker went very still, and for a moment Jacob wondered if he had pushed too far, said something that would end the conversation with violence instead of words. But when it spoke again, there was something different in its voice, a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "I am justice," it said, but the words lacked the conviction they had carried earlier. "Your pain," Jacob replied. "Pain and grief and rage that's had 60 years to fester and grow. But that's not the same thing as justice." The green eyes studied him for a long moment, and Jacob had the unsettling sensation of being weighed and measured by something that could see far deeper than flesh and bone. Then, without warning, the Shadow Walker was gone, vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the scent of sage smoke and the memory of eyes like green fire. Jacob sat for a while longer, listening to the night sounds of the desert and thinking about what had just happened. The encounter had been a test, he realized, but not the kind he had expected. The Shadow Walker hadn't been trying to frighten him or gauge his courage. It had been looking for something else, something that had to do with understanding rather than strength. Tomorrow, he would ride out into the rocks where Walking Shadow had made his final stand. Tomorrow, he would face the Shadow Walker on its own ground, with weapons both conventional and otherwise. But tonight, he had taken the first step toward understanding his enemy, and perhaps more importantly, understanding himself. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled, its voice rising and falling in a song as old as the land itself. But there was no answer from the Shadow Walker, no echo of supernatural menace. For the first time since arriving in Bitter Creek, Jacob allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to end this that didn't require anyone else to die. But hope was a dangerous thing on the frontier, and he had learned long ago not to count on anything except his own skill and the reliability of his weapons. Still, as he finally rose and headed inside for what might be his last night of sleep, Jacob carried that small flame of possibility with him into the darkness, a light to hold against whatever tomorrow might bring. The Shadow Walker had come and gone, and both of them were still alive. It was, he reflected, a better start than he had dared to expect. Now all he had to do was find a way to finish what Walking Shadow had started 60 years ago, and do it in a way that honored both the living and the dead. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the desert sky, promising rain that might or might not come. But Jacob had made his peace with uncertainty long ago. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, and he would face it as he had faced everything else in his life, with steady hands, clear eyes, and whatever courage he could summon from the depths of his weathered soul. The hunt was about to begin in earnest. But for the first time since taking this job, Jacob Thorne felt like he might actually know what he was hunting for.